Hey there, Ledgers. Welcome to GLBC Connections. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'm not sure how I got the short straw on this chapter, but that's all right. It'll be good. Um, you'll see in a minute. So, Paul has a little bit of everything in chapter 7 on marriage and sex and singleness. And so the first few verses are about sex and marriage, that it's good and it's not good to abstain. Later on, Paul talks about singleness and that it's good too. And so, of course, unless you're burning with passion. And later on, he speaks to the idea that if you're married to an unbeliever, you should stick with it if they want to stick with it. That, of course, is if you come to Christ while you're married and your spouse doesn't. So he speaks of not entering into marriage with an unbeliever in other parts of the book. Uh, he goes on to say later that, again, it's good to be single, especially if you want to devote yourself to the Lord's work. And then later on, he says if your spouse dies, you can remarry, but being single is good too. So Paul's got a lot of good words about being single in this chapter. But I want us to look at the first 7 verses. And, in our culture, sex is all about what you get from the other person, the pleasure that you receive. And so the worst examples of this are rape, prostitution, pornography, and any kinds of sexual abuse. Those are like the extreme expressions of this idea of sex is about what you get out of it, but it also is seen in other parts of our culture. In the hookup culture, where anything goes, sex without commitment, it's given and taken in that context. In marriage, it's sometimes seen as something you demand or withhold, or you use it as a weapon. That again, that objectifies it to just the being about what you can get out of the other person's body. And oftentimes, sex is in our culture is portrayed about getting what you want from another person. And if you're not getting what you want from that person, then you go looking in other places. So, our culture looks at sex in primarily one way, and it's about what you can get. And Paul says something radical about sex in chapter 7, verse 1, and he says just the opposite. He says sex in marriage is about what you give to your spouse, not what you give. And so we'll be talking about that. There's lots of stuff we're not talking about with sexuality, and we'll let Brian and John take care of the rest of that. But we will talk about verses 1 through 7. And so check it out. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And so there was probably some overzealous celibacy sheriffs. It's easy for me to say, right? Overzealous celibacy sheriffs. And so there were probably some people who were saying that celibacy was good even in marriage. And Paul says, no, not true. He does talk about it in other places, but in marriage he says you shouldn't. So you shouldn't participate in celibacy. He says this, verse 2. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with their own husband. So there's stuff all around that's tempting. And I'm sure in the Corinthian context, it was a pretty wild scene. And so he's saying, because of this, you shouldn't abstain. As we keep reading, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. And so it's a responsibility that both the husband has to his wife and the wife has to her husband. Verse 4, and this is where Paul says something really radical. The first part's not so radical, but the second part is. He says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And so in that patriarchal culture, I mean, that was like no big deal. But then Paul says, in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. And so we see that there's this mutual yielding of our bodies to each other in marriage, that we're looking out for the interest of the other. Isn't that amazing? Even the gospel affects our sexuality. And then, so verse 5, he goes on to say this: do not deprive each other except for perhaps by mutual consent. So if you do deprive, if you do stop, do it by an agreement and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So Paul's a realist in this idea that there's temptation out there and Satan wants to lead people astray, and it's also a self-control thing. It's a physical thing. It's physiological. Verse 6, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, single, but each of you has your own gift from God, and one has this gift and another has that. Interesting, isn't it? So in our culture, when we think about sex, our culture says, give it to me. And Paul says, it's the opposite. We should say, I give myself to you. In our culture, it says, you owe it to me. And Paul says we should say, I owe it to you. It's a duty. And so we see in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 7, that sex is for marriage and it should be enjoyed. I guess one way you could say it is sex is procreation, recreation, and preservation. I thought that might be an interesting way to wrap it up. So, you know how to apply this passage if you're married. God bless. Take care.